Imagine a single freight train stretching 1.8 kilometers long, carrying the equivalent of 110 massive B-double trucks, thundering through the heart of Australia's most unforgiving terrain. This isn't science fiction. It's the reality of Australia's inland rail, a $14.5 billion gamble that's carving through 1,600 kilometers of some of the continent's most challenging landscapes. But here's what doesn't make sense. Why would a nation spend more than the GDP of entire countries to build what seems like just another railway through empty desert? The answer lies buried in a crisis that's been choking Australia's economy for decades. One that most people never see but affects every single product on every store shelf across the continent. To understand why Australia is undertaking this monumental engineering feat, we need to travel back to the 1990s when the country's freight network was already buckling under pressure. Every year, tens of thousands of massive trucks clog the Pacific Highway between Melbourne and Brisbane, turning what should have been efficient cargo movement into a logistical nightmare. The existing coastal rail route, built over a century ago, was so slow and inefficient that it took 33 hours to move freight between Australia's two largest economic centers, making trucking the only viable option despite its enormous environmental and financial costs. The numbers were staggering in ways that few Australians fully grasped at the time. By the early 2000s, the freight task between Melbourne and Brisbane was growing at a rate of 2.6% annually, meaning cargo volumes would double every 27 years. To put this in perspective, if you lined up all the trucks that would be needed to handle Australia's projected freight growth by 2050, they would stretch from Sydney to Perth and back again. The road infrastructure couldn't handle this tsunami of commerce, and the environmental cost was becoming impossible to ignore. Each truck journey between Melbourne and Brisbane produced roughly 1.5 tons of carbon emissions compared to just 0.6 tons for the same cargo moved by rail. The breakthrough moment came in 2006 when transport planners realized that Australia needed what no one thought was possible: a completely new freight corridor cutting through the continent's interior. This wasn't about upgrading existing infrastructure. This was about reimagining how goods move across one of the world's largest countries. The proposed inland rail would slice travel time from 33 hours to less than 24 hours, making rail competitive with road transport for the first time in Australian history. But the scale of what they were proposing was almost incomprehensible. The project would require boring through the Toowoomba Range with a 6.2-kilometer tunnel, the largest diameter diesel freight tunnel in the Southern Hemisphere. It would cross 30 local government areas, span 3 states, and require upgrading 1,000 kilometers of existing track while building 600 kilometers of completely new railway. The engineering challenges were so complex that the project was divided into 13 separate sections, each presenting unique geological and logistical nightmares. The human drama behind this decision centered on a simple but powerful realization. Australia's economic future depended on solving a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Transport Minister Anthony Albanese, who championed the early feasibility studies, understood that without dramatic action, Australia's freight network would collapse under its own success. The country's mining boom was generating unprecedented wealth, but that wealth was meaningless if it couldn't be efficiently transported to ports and processing centers. Agricultural exports, which fed millions of people across Asia, were being strangled by transport bottlenecks that added days to shipping schedules and millions to costs. By 2010, the Australian government had committed to the largest freight rail project in the nation's history. But they were about to discover that the real challenges weren't financial. They were buried deep beneath the Australian continent itself. The geological surveys revealed a landscape that seemed designed to defeat railway construction. Ancient rock formations harder than concrete, underground water systems that could flood tunnels, and soil conditions that shifted like quicksand. What had started as a transport project was becoming an underground expedition into some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, where every kilometer forward would require innovations that didn't yet exist. The solution to Australia's freight crisis required more than just building a railway. It demanded conquering geology that had remained untouched since the continent formed 500 million years ago. When tunnel boring machines first attempted to cut through the Toowoomba Range in 2018, Engineers discovered rock formations so hard they shattered standard cutting tools designed for European soil conditions. This wasn't just about moving dirt and laying track. This was about boring through stone that had been compressed under unimaginable pressure for geological ages, creating a natural fortress that seemed almost designed to stop human ambition. The technical specifications of what they were attempting bordered on the impossible. The main tunnel through the Toowoomba Range would stretch 6.2 kilometers, longer than 60 city blocks, and accommodate freight trains traveling at 115 kilometers per hour. Each of these trains would measure 1.8 kilometers in length, roughly the distance from the Sydney Opera House to the Harbour Bridge, and weigh as much as 4,000 automobiles. The tunnel itself required a diameter large enough to accommodate double-stacked shipping containers, making it wider than a typical subway tunnel and deeper than a 15-story building. But the Toowoomba Tunnel was just one piece of an engineering puzzle that spanned an area larger than most European countries. Across Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria, construction crews faced challenges that ranged from flash flooding in desert regions to unstable soil that could swallow entire sections of track. In some areas, workers had to install concrete foundations 10 meters deep, the height of a 3-story building, to create stable ground for the rails. The project required moving 200 million cubic meters of earth, enough soil to bury the entire city of Canberra under a meter of dirt. The human cost of this ambition became clear when communities along the proposed route began fighting back with a ferocity that caught planners completely off guard. In Queensland's Condamine Valley, farmers whose families had worked the same land for 5 generations discovered that the railway would bisect their properties, cutting through irrigation systems and separating livestock from water sources. Local councils filed injunctions, environmental groups launched legal challenges, and property owners demanded compensation that threatened to double the project's cost. What had been presented as economic salvation became a source of community division that lasted for years. The controversy deepened when engineers realized that standard railway construction techniques simply wouldn't work in Australia's unique environment. Traditional ballast and sleeper systems, perfected in Europe's temperate climate, began failing within months when exposed to the Outback's extreme temperature swings. During summer, steel rails expanded so dramatically that they buckled like ribbon, while winter contractions created gaps that could derail entire trains. The solution required developing new steel alloys and expansion joint systems that had never been tested at this scale, turning every kilometer of track into a material science experiment. The most significant obstacle emerged from an unexpected source: Australia's own success in environmental protection. The inland rail route crossed habitats for 47 threatened species, including the endangered bridled nail-tail wallaby and the critically endangered regent honeyeater. Ecological impact assessments revealed that construction would affect over 1,000 kilometers of native vegetation, requiring the creation of wildlife corridors and offset areas covering more territory than some small nations. Each species required specific mitigation strategies, transforming what should have been a straightforward construction project into a complex ecosystem management project. The financial pressures mounted as global supply chain disruptions in 2020 sent construction costs soaring beyond all projections. Steel prices doubled, concrete became scarce, and specialized tunnel boring equipment faced 18-month delivery delays. Project managers watched helplessly as their $10 billion budget stretched toward $14.5 billion, then beyond. At the same time, politicians demanded explanations, and taxpayers questioned whether the entire undertaking was worth the astronomical cost. The Australian Railtrack Corporation found itself managing not just a construction project, but a national controversy that threatened to derail the entire initiative. Yet beneath all these challenges, something remarkable was happening that few observers noticed at the time. The tunnel boring machines, working around the clock in shifts, had begun making unexpected discoveries about Australia's geological history. Deep beneath the Toowoomba Range, they uncovered rock formations that revealed how the continent had drifted across the planet over millions of years, providing scientists with data that would revolutionize the understanding of Australian geology. The railway project was accidentally becoming one of the largest geological surveys in the nation's history, with implications that extended far beyond transportation infrastructure. By 2024, as the first sections of inland rail began carrying freight trains at speeds that would have been impossible just a decade earlier, the project had achieved something no one anticipated. It had fundamentally altered how Australia thought about distance itself. The Parkes to Narromine section, completed in late 2023, demonstrated that freight could move between these regional centers in half the time previously required, transforming small agricultural communities into vital links in a continental supply chain. What had started as a transportation project had become something far more significant, a reimagining of how a continent-sized nation could function as a single economic unit. The numbers that emerged from the project's early operations defied every skeptical projection made during the controversial construction years. Freight volumes on completed sections exceeded projections by 40%, with each 1.8-kilometer train removing an average of 110 truck journeys from Australia's highway system. To put this impact in perspective, if you lined up all the trucks that Inland Rail removes from roads each year, they would stretch from Melbourne to Adelaide, a convoy of over 900 kilometers of eliminated road congestion. The carbon emissions reduction was equally dramatic, with preliminary data suggesting the project would prevent 750,000 tons of CO2 annually once fully operational. But the most surprising transformation occurred in the regional communities that had initially opposed the railway's construction. Towns like Parkes, once known primarily as the home of a radio telescope, found themselves becoming logistics hubs connecting Australia's agricultural heartland to Asian markets. Property values in these previously declining rural centers increased by an average of 23% as businesses relocated to take advantage of the new freight connections. The railway had accidentally created what urban planners call linear urbanization, development following transportation corridors in ways that revitalized entire regions that had been economically stagnant for decades. The project's geological discoveries proved even more valuable than anyone had imagined during the controversial tunneling phase. Data collected during construction revealed previously unknown mineral deposits worth an estimated $12 billion, including rare earth elements crucial for renewable energy technology. The tunnel boring operations had essentially conducted the world's most expensive geological survey, mapping subsurface resources with precision that would have been impossible through traditional exploration methods. Mining companies began purchasing geological data from the project, creating an unexpected revenue stream that helped offset construction overruns. Perhaps most remarkably, the engineering innovations developed for inland rail began finding applications in projects around the world. The specialized tunnel boring techniques perfected in the Toowoomba Range were licensed for use in infrastructure projects in India and Brazil, where similar geological challenges had previously stymied railway construction. Australian engineering firms found themselves exporting expertise in extreme environment railway construction, creating a new industry sector that generated hundreds of millions in overseas revenue. The project had accidentally made Australia a global leader in freight rail technology. The environmental outcomes exceeded even the most optimistic projections made during the planning phase. Wildlife corridors created for threatened species became thriving ecosystems that supported biodiversity beyond what existed before construction began. The offset areas, covering more than 8,000 hectares of preserved habitat, created connected corridors that allowed native species to move between previously fragmented environments. Monitoring data from 2024 showed population increases in 23 threatened species within these protected zones, proving that large infrastructure projects could enhance rather than degrade environmental outcomes when properly planned. International freight companies began reshaping their Asia-Pacific strategies around inland rail's capabilities, recognizing that Australia had created something unique in global logistics. The project's ability to move containerized freight from Brisbane to Melbourne in under 24 hours meant that Australian agricultural exports could reach Asian markets with freshness previously impossible. Japanese and South Korean importers began including inland rail delivery specifications in their Australian supplier contracts, resulting in premium pricing for goods transported via the new system. Australia had built not just a railway, but a competitive advantage in global food supply chains. The success story that emerged from what had been dismissed by critics as an expensive mistake in the desert demonstrates something profound about infrastructure investment in the 21st century. What began as a simple freight railway had accidentally created a model for how nations could adapt their transportation systems for climate change, resource constraints, and changing global trade patterns. As extreme weather events increasingly disrupt road and air transport, the underground sections of inland rail provide climate-resilient freight movement that continues operating when other systems fail. Today, as engineers plan similar projects in Canada, Russia, and Brazil, they study the inland rail model as proof that continental-scale infrastructure can transform economies in ways that extend far beyond their original purpose. The project that critics once called a railway to nowhere had become a template for 21st century nation building, proving that sometimes the most ambitious projects succeed precisely because they're ambitious enough to create opportunities no one originally envisioned. What do you think about Australia's massive gamble on this underground freight revolution? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the mega projects reshaping our world.